evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this special event. My name is Jordan Wood. I'm the Executive Director of Democracy First, tonight's event sponsor. Democracy First was founded after the 2020 election to help restore the cross-partisan consensus for the core pro-democracy principles that underpin our electoral system. We call these principles the Democracy First Promise. They are ensuring the right to vote for eligible citizens, denouncing political violence against election workers and your opponents, stopping the spread of misinformation about our electoral system, and most importantly, accepting the outcome of the election when all the votes are counted, certifying that result and supporting the peaceful transfer of power. These are not principles that are liberal or conservative. They are not democratic or Republican. They are simply rules that we all must agree to in order to preserve our democratic republic. The Democracy First Promise campaign calls on elected officials and candidates to publicly embrace these principles. To date, nearly 700 elected officials, primarily in the battleground states, have made the promise. Right here in Montgomery County, I'm proud to say, all 3 county commissioners, state legislators, and your member of Congress have made the promise. So therefore, it is my honor to bring out Congresswoman Dean to welcome and open tonight's event.
Wow. What a crowd. You are beautiful, even though it's hard to see you. You are absolutely beautiful. I'm so delighted to be here with you. Welcome. Welcome to the Keswick Theater. Welcome to my hometown of Glenside. And so I have the great honor of being able to welcome you and to welcome our panelists and our guests. I am mindful of all of us here that we're worried about our friends and relatives in Florida in harm's way. May we be spared the most, because after all, we are in this all together. My goodness, you are a handsome crowd, and I think it's a reflection of the program that we have tonight, because we would all like to be watching our Phillies, I know that. I just got an update, 1-0 Phillies, am I right? That's going to get the biggest applause. No, democracy will get the biggest applause, thank you. So I take it, and I want our panelists to know that this is a huge compliment to them and what they are working on, what we are all working on. Glenside and the Keswick Theater. Liz and friends, you are in my hometown. So many folks' hometown. This is the center of the universe, as my husband declared it decades ago. You see, this place is where I was born and raised, my husband too. This place is where my father, Bob Dean, grew up here beginning more than 100 years ago, and where my husband's family settled more than 80 years ago, and where we raised our boys for at least 12 years before moving all the way to Jenkintown. My uncle Walter Dean, I want you to know this place is amazing. As a child in 7th and 8th grade at St. Luke's Elementary School, he would race here after school and read a script handed in front of him on some radio show in the 30s. It was called like Billy and Betsy. He did that day after day. They didn't pay him anything. They finally bought him a bike, I think just to get him here faster. This theater also is historic because it was briefly the home of St. Luke's the Evangelist Church while we were rebuilding the church. How we loved the comfortable seats and no kneelers. Just loved it. This place is important to us. It is just a stone's throw away from the birthplace of our democracy. Our very roots, it's in our DNA here. not far from where, in December 1777, Washington encamped at Valley Forge, engaged in the Battle of Edge Hill, and crossed the Delaware to his victorious attack on Trenton. You know, it was George Washington. Sure, that does deserve a round of applause. You know, it was George Washington, I'm very mindful of this these years, all those nearly 250 years ago, taught us, quote, "Democracy is as a garden. It is on us to weed out the bad ideas and to cultivate the good ones." Isn't that true in this election cycle? And do you remember when candidate Obama was here in this very theater in 2008? He too reminds us that we must tend to our democracy. We must tend to it as a garden. It is something precious. And so women being here is so important. This is the center of the universe. The women that we are about to introduce to the stage, they are patriots. And I think of them and I think of Martin Luther King's expression about the appalling silence of good people. These women will not be silent. They will not sit silently. And I'm very proud of them because they are putting down, and I stand with them, putting down the garments of our political parties and instead taking up the tapestry that is our democracy. So thank you. Thank you, Jordan Wood, Executive Director of Small D, Democracy First, and to our guest, Alyssa Farah Griffin, former White House Director of Strategic Communications and many other titles, Press Secretary to Mike Pence, Sarah Matthews, Deputy Press Secretary for former President Trump. Yes, a round of applause. And Cassidy Hutchinson. Whoa. I'm with all of you. Former White House assistant to then Chief of Staff to President Trump, Mark Meadows. I am so proud of you, Cassidy, though I have no right to, but I sure am. Your composure, your courage, your strength, your willingness to put yourself forward at personal risk, you did it for our country. I just admire you. What we see in Cassidy is something we search for in ourselves, so we're glad to have her here. And finally, Congresswoman Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney, my colleague and friend. Imagine that, born out of tragedy, a friendship that will be forever. As Cassidy has said of Liz, she has a spine of steel and yet cares deeply about this country. That is Liz Cheney in a nutshell. She is focused on decency, on democracy. It's the first time I ever spoke to Liz Cheney, and I'll end with this, was on January the 6th. We had all been hauled out of the Capitol. I was up in the gallery, taken out in a gas mask with others. She had been on the floor preparing the arguments around the certification of election. And we were all taken to a large safe room, and I was disoriented. It was hundreds of us in there, staff, members, both parties, of course, and some press. And I was disoriented as to where we were. And when I finally got my bearings, I thought, oh, I know where I am. This is where we served for the first impeachment. I sat in this very room, the Ways and Means room, very elegant room. And I went to the back because I knew there was a television back there. You see, we didn't have TV. We didn't know what was going on for hours. And so when I crossed into this very back narrow hallway to search for the TV I knew was back there, I ran into Liz. And I said, Liz, I'm Madeline Dean. I said, I'm from suburban Philadelphia. Don't they know they've gone too far? And she looked at me and said, Madeline, some of them do. And we formed a friendship, a bond that day. And she and Hakeem Jeffries said, we will go back on the floor. They will not keep us from certifying this election, from our constitutional duty. So I am in awe of Liz and these women. I thank you for the honor of being with you all here tonight and for letting me welcome them to our hometown of Glenside. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Congresswoman. When we started Democracy First, I had personally been barricaded in our office on January 6th, and there was a lot of staffers like me in that situation. So tonight is special because, yes, we have the Congresswoman Cheney, but we also have staffers who are doing a very courageous thing right now. To preserve our democracy and this republic, we don't just need principles, but we need leaders, courageous leaders, who are willing to defend those principles when they are under threat, when it's most difficult politically to do so. Nobody embodies that more than Congresswoman Liz Cheney. So please join me in welcoming the Congresswoman.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Wow, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to Jordan and Democracy First and to my wonderful friend Madeline Dean for your service to our country and your patriotism and for welcoming us here. I'm going to bring shortly here my fellow panelists out on the stage, but I just wanted to say a word about why we're here, how important this is. This is the first time that the four of us have ever appeared together on stage. And we felt it was so important to be able to do that here in Pennsylvania, to be able to do it in Montgomery County, to be able to do it in a place where you all know and feel and live every day how important our democracy is, how important the vote is, and where you all will determine, perhaps more than any other community in any other state in our country, how this election goes and why it matters so much. I just want to talk for a moment about what happened after the last election and how unique and uniquely horrible it was. Madeline talked about Valley Forge, and she talked about George Washington. Beginning with George Washington, every single American president honored and fulfilled their solemn obligation to guarantee the peaceful transition of power until Donald Trump. Every one of them. And it can become exhausting when you think about what he's done, and it can become easy to think, you know what, we're going to look away from that, we're not going to focus on it, and we have to resist that. Every single one of us has a responsibility and an obligation to remember the facts, to remember that on January 6th of 2021, when Donald Trump woke up, his intention was that he would stay in office despite having lost the election. He refused to concede. He refused to abide by the rulings of the courts. Instead, we now know that he put in place a multi-part plan that was orchestrated to overturn the election, orchestrated to throw out the votes of people here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, orchestrated to pressure state legislatures to flip votes from Biden to Trump. That he undertook a campaign to corruptly pressure his vice president, that he told the Justice Department, the United States Department of Justice, he told the Justice Department to lie for him, to spread his fraudulent, stolen election claims, and that he summoned a mob to Washington, D.C. with these lies these toxic lies about our election. And then he sent that armed mob to the United States Capitol to try to stop us from carrying out our constitutional duty. And as the violent mob attacked the Capitol in Donald Trump's name, as they brutally beat law enforcement officers, hunted the vice president and the Speaker of the House, he watched on television. He watched the attack on television for hours. He refused repeatedly. He was sitting in the dining room next to the Oval Office, and he refused repeatedly to tell the mob to leave. And when he finally did speak publicly after 3 hours, more than 3 hours, he didn't condemn the mob. In fact, he praised them. Now, what I've just laid out, what we know about what Donald Trump did, those facts don't come from his political opponents. They come from the people closest to him. It's the people closest to Donald Trump who've testified that he did not want to stop the violent attack on the Capitol. When he realized that Mike Pence, Vice President Pence, would not do what Donald Trump wanted, Trump sent out a tweet attacking him and further inflaming the mob. And we know now that one of his most senior aides said shortly after the tweet went out, this aide received a phone call telling him that Pence had been evacuated. Pence's life was under threat, and he'd been evacuated from his office off the Senate floor. This aide recounted that he went running down the hallway into the Oval Office, hoping that when he told Donald Trump that Pence had been evacuated, that would encourage Trump finally to take action to tell the mob to leave. But instead, after this aide delivered that news, President Trump looked at him and said only, "So what? So what?" It's also from his closest aides that we know that while this attack was happening, Donald Trump was handed a note. And the note said a civilian had been shot at the entrance to the United States House of Representatives. And they're the ones who testified that he put the note on the table in front of him, and he continued to watch television. And he wouldn't tell the mob to leave. Now, when you think about his conduct during those little over 3 hours, and in the days leading up to it, it doesn't matter if you are a Democrat or a Republican or an independent. That's depravity. And as a people, we can never become numb to that. Any person who would do those things can never be entrusted with power again. Our nation requires leaders of character. We require leaders, men and women, who will lead us with what Abraham Lincoln called a sincere heart. Our nation's second president, John Adams, wrote a letter to his wife, Abigail, on the first night that he spent in the White House. And in the letter, he wrote a prayer. And the wording of the prayer is so special that President Kennedy had it carved over the mantelpiece in the state dining room in the White House. And it says, "May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." Now, I also always need to be clear, I'm sure that John Adams meant women too. And in this election, a broad coalition, a coalition unlike any that we have seen, certainly in modern American history, has come together to defeat Donald Trump. It is a coalition This is a coalition that may disagree on some things, but we're bound together as we work to elect Vice President Kamala Harris. We are bound together. That deserves definitely applause. We are bound together by one thing that matters more than any other, and that's our love of this country, our belief in our duty to the Constitution, and our belief in the miracle and the blessing of this great nation. We also know we must live in a nation where future generations know that they can have leaders who will guarantee the peaceful transfer of power, people of character, people of character and good faith who will set partisan battles aside to do the right thing. And now I want to introduce to you three such incredible young Americans. These women are, all of them, women who have stood up to do what's right. They have stood up to tell the truth. And they truly are meeting this moment. You know, a few hours ago, Donald Trump was on a podcast, and he said, "America is not a great nation." Now, we all know America is the greatest nation that has ever existed. And as I bring out these wonderful, inspirational young women that I'm honored to call my friends, I want you to know that they represent the greatness of this nation. And if anybody has any doubts, listen to them. Let me now welcome Alyssa Farah, Sarah Matthews, and Cassidy Hutchinson to the stage. Well, it's wonderful to see you guys. Wonderful welcome. Let me start, Alyssa. You resigned from the White House in December, on December 4th. But during the attack of January 6th, you were one of a number of individuals who were texting into Mark Meadows, saying that the president needed to tell people to go home. He needed to tell them to leave. We know that there were a number of others, members of Congress, people like Congressman Loudermilk, and members of the media who were, Sean Hannity, texting the president saying he's got to tell people, texting Meadows saying he needs to tell people to leave, Laura Ingraham, many individuals who knew at the time, who were saying privately how dangerous this was, that the election hadn't been stolen, but who now have bought into or have decided that they're going to spread the lies. Can you talk a little bit about what you think has happened and what's contributed to that?
Yes, and it's an honor to be here with you, Liz. If I may just say quickly, when every man in politics that I'd worked for and looked up to and admired let me down by not speaking up and telling the truth about what every one of us saw and what every one of us knew of January 6th and just Donald Trump's failure of character that we witnessed up close and personal so many times, there was one person who stood alone and stood up for the truth, and it was you. And you're such an inspiration to all of us. And listen, I'll never forget that day. I had resigned because I was uncomfortable with the lies about the election. And I was watching from my in-laws down in Florida this attack on our nation's capital. I'd worked there for many years. I was familiar with the halls of Congress. My former boss, Mike Pence, was in the Capitol with his family, and I was fearful for him. And I sent the text to Mark Meadows, who's someone I was very close with. I considered him like a second father in many ways, saying, you need to get the president to denounce this. If he doesn't, people will die. And then I pushed him further and said, if he won't, you should. Because what you should know is, in the West Wing, there are always cameras from every network lined up right outside of the West Wing. So if at any moment a senior official had wanted to walk out, a chief of staff, someone who's in the West Wing, they could have said, stand down, the election wasn't stolen, you're being lied to, do not attack the Capitol, and they chose not to. What stands out to me as I look back on that day nearly 4 years later is collectively the morning after, everyone knew it was wrong. Every Republican I knew on Capitol Hill, every member of Congress, I heard from many of them, I'm sure you did. I was on Fox News the next day to talk about why this is not who we are as a country and why we needed to turn the page on Donald Trump and rebuild a conservative movement we could be proud of. But over time, he crept back in, and there's a lot of incentive structures to staying near where the power is. I saw people I used to respect who they cared more about their reelection, they cared more about their fundraising, they cared more about being accepted in right-wing media and getting booked on television and getting invited to the right parties to say what we all knew to be right. And it's really saddening to know that on something so foundational, that so many people were gonna go with what was easy and just pretend that they didn't see him for who he truly was. And it's just truly disappointing.
I think that it's a reflection too, and I think it's important for the audience to know, not only have you guys faced tremendous public pressure for being willing to speak the truth, but you've faced certainly pressure and bullying privately and from people that you used to consider friends. You've paid a price for being willing to speak the truth, and you're an example for all of us. Sarah, you resigned on the 6th itself, and people may not know the sequence of events or your story, but for you, when President Trump made the video and posted it and called the people that had just brutalized the Capitol and law enforcement, when he said he loved them and he called them special people, I think that was the moment when you said, I won't defend this, I can't defend this. Can you talk about what you faced on that day and your decision?
Yeah, so I'm often asked what was the moment where I knew I was going to break with Donald Trump. And it was a slow burn because I knew on election night that Donald Trump had lost. And I grew increasingly uncomfortable with his behavior in the aftermath, in the days that followed, where I saw that he stopped listening to the people who were telling him the truth, that he did not win the election and there was no evidence of fraud. And he started listening to the people who would tell him what he wanted to hear, which was conspiracy theories. And then he used those conspiracy theories from his platform to inspire a mob to attack the Capitol on January 6th. And I was in the West Wing that day. And I sat there and watched as advisor after advisor went into the Oval Office dining room to beg and plead with him. And I did the same with people that I knew had his ear. I said, he needs to tell these people to leave. He needs to call off the mob, and he needs to condemn the violence that we're seeing. And what did he do? He sat there and didn't lift a finger. And I kept hoping and praying that he would meet the moment, because I knew that this was the ultimate test. And for 187 minutes, he sat there while we watched police officers get beaten, brutally beaten. And I also worked at the Capitol prior to going and working at the White House. So that is somewhere where it's familiar to me. I had friends who were in the building that day who were scared, and I was scared for them. And to know that Donald Trump, it was just a complete dereliction of duty on his part to not call off the mob up until after Capitol Police had finally regained control of the building. That's when he sends out this video and posts it. And what does he say? He says, "We love you, you're very special." These are people that we just watched brutally attack police officers. And he didn't want to condemn the violence. And he finally told them to leave with peace. Okay, yeah, you kind of missed that 187 minutes ago. But it just showed me that he could not meet the moment and rise to the occasion when it called for it. And I had lost complete faith in him. And I was deputy press secretary, meaning that as a spokesperson for him, my job was to defend every policy, every word of his. And I didn't always agree with him. But on that day, I knew I could not defend his behavior because it was indefensible. So I went home that evening. And called my loved ones and informed them of my decision, and thankfully they were supportive. And the next call I made actually was to the woman right beside me, Alyssa Farrah-Griffin. And she helped me craft my resignation statement that evening, and I was inspired by her courage to resign the previous month. And she gave me the strength to make that decision, because I will say I was 25 years old when I resigned. And maybe my frontal lobe had finally fully developed, but But I just want to thank Alyssa in this moment for giving me that strength.
It's truly amazing when you think about, and I don't mean to embarrass you guys by talking about how young you are, but I was struck on a number of occasions by the fact that my daughters are your ages, and there was one moment in particular when Cassidy had come in for one of her interviews with the committee, and I was really struck watching what you had been through and the decisions that you had made to tell the truth, and I said to you that I have daughters your age, and that I would only hope that if they ever were faced with what you were faced with, that they would conduct themselves with the kind of grace and character and honor that you all have. And so we're deeply grateful to all of you for that. And Cassidy, I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the decision that you made, why it was so important to you to speak out and to tell the truth, and why it continues to be important to do that in this election cycle.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for being here tonight. And I would love to answer your question, but just to backtrack slightly, I will never forget this, and I've thought a lot about how to properly articulate this in a public forum, but it was the night before I testified live, and we had a phone conversation, and it was, I admit this, but a bit of a pity call on my front. I was very nervous. I was very confident in what I was doing the next day and that it was the right thing. But I was nervous to do it. I was nervous to do it on my own. And you had said to me that it's important that women and little girls see me do the right thing. And it made a massive impact on me in that moment, but that impact has only grown as the weeks and months and years have passed since. And last week, seeing you stand on stage with Vice President and soon-to-be President Kamala Harris, to me is the best full circle moment of that, because if there's one image that I hope that my future children, God willing, get to see from this election cycle, it's that political cowardice does not win, and that women with spines of steel, like Ms. Cheney here, are saving our country. So thank you for the sacrifices you've made, too. And would you mind repeating your question?
That was a great answer. I don't remember the question.
Then we can move on. My decision to
Your
come
decision,
forward.
yeah, and just to help have people sort of put themselves in your shoes, and you may sell yourself short here, but you were 24, 25 years old, working in the West Wing of the White House, and men senior to you, including people who were your bosses, were not willing to come forward and tell the truth about this horrific and dangerous thing that Donald Trump had done. What gave you the courage to make the decision that you needed to do the right thing?
The short answer to that, there were a lot of small moments of courage, most of which happened behind closed doors that people will never know about. Moments where I had to self-reflect and really dig into who I am and the public servant that I had wanted to become, but saw who I was becoming in my service to Donald Trump. January 6th was a horrific day for many reasons, and I'm sure we'll touch on many of them this evening. But when I was in the West Wing that day, there was a lot that struck me. But you know when Donald Trump is mad because he reacts to things, and it was his lack of reaction that afternoon. It was the fact that he sat in the Oval Office dining room, seemingly enjoying what he was watching on television, with his vice president in danger, with members of Congress in danger, because he was trying to assuage his own injured pride. It was a betrayal of the oath that he swore to the country, but more importantly, in my opinion, it was a betrayal of the American people. He had spent, at that point, nearly 5 years, 6 years, convincing good, hardworking American people that they were under siege, that they were under threat. But that day showed, in my view, that he is the threat, that Donald Trump is the threat, that Donald Trump put us under siege. And that day, he was willing to go to whatever means necessary to retain power, and that is something that our founders warned us against. And thinking about that, and I wish that I had a more linear journey. I wish that I had made the courageous decision like Sarah, Alyssa, and Miss Cheney much sooner than I did, but it did take a year and a half. And I, for a while, felt like I was kind of caught between two worlds, because on one hand, I was very embedded in Trump world, what I refer to as Trump world, where things were excused and rationalized, and sometimes it did make sense. But then there was my conscience, and my conscience kept winning over and over. And then it wasn't until April of 2022 that I called a Republican member of Congress who did not serve on the January 6th committee in a sort of near mental breakdown, because I did not like who I was becoming, but I wanted to find my way back. And he implored me to go look in the mirror, and then made a sarcastic joke saying, "Don't look at your appearance. I'm not asking if you like the way you look right now. Can you live with the person that you're looking at right now for the rest of your life?" And in that moment, I knew possibly physically I could, but I wouldn't want to live with that person for the rest of my life. And it was women like Sarah and Alyssa and Liz who had made the courageous decision much sooner than I did, but helped me find my way back to the right side of history. And ultimately, that's why I'm here today, and I'm eternally grateful for the leadership that you all showed in that journey too.
You know, your story, Cassidy, sort of a story about conscience and about character. It's so important as people think about this election. And you know, sometimes I'm sure all of us will hear people say, well, you know, I don't like what Donald Trump did, but, you know, I like his policies, and we can have a whole discussion about that. Because his policies are dangerous as well. But there's a level of, you know, what you all have described and what happened on the 6th, of cruelty, and what we've seen him do, you know, since then, sort of this vindictiveness, a complete lack of compassion, a pettiness. And I think that as people are thinking about anyone who is still thinking about whether or not that kind of a person can lead, I wonder, Alyssa, if you could just talk a little bit about, you know, what does it mean to have someone sitting in the Oval Office who displays all of those characteristics?
It's a great question because, of course, January 6th was this horrific day in American history. It's a mar on our history. He showed how unfit he was. But that was just kind of the encapsulation of who Donald Trump the man is. I've worked for many politicians. I've worked for military leaders. He is the person of the lowest moral character that I've ever worked for. And I mean that just sincerely. In how he makes decisions, and how he treats staff, and how he treats his opponents and those who he might, just be against in the political sphere, but is still somebody that's an American in this country. I mean, we've seen it recently, frankly, this election cycle. He's demonizing immigrants in the most vile way, spreading lies he knows to be untrue. We're in the midst of, our hearts go out to the people affected by the hurricane. He is telling lies that are dangerous and put people at risk. That is who he is to his core. And the first term, you had people like Vice President Pence there, an imperfect actor, but somebody who I genuinely think tried to guide him the right way and keep him focused and in bounds with the Constitution. You had leaders who swore their oaths and actually upheld them. That is not what you will have in a second term. They're openly telling you loyalty is the #1 thing. And they don't want Ronald Reagan Republicans, they want Tucker Carlson Republicans, so buckle up, guys. You will not have guardrails. So his worst instincts, those poor moral character that he has, and then being surrounded by people who will just never say no to him. It's incredibly dangerous here at home for our policies and how we're affected, and also abroad. Well, we may get to this, but Ukraine, he will abandon our allies. He will sell them out in a heartbeat. That is who he is. It's about what benefits him. He does not, I will suffice to say, the man that you saw on January 6th is the man that he is every day. Don't let him fool you.
One of the areas that we all, as people who have been in the Republican Party, I'm thinking about the tense I use there, but that you hear now often from Republicans is that they're the party of law enforcement, and I do think it's important. Donald Trump says this all the time, and he tries to convince people that that he and J.D. Vance and the Republican Party support law enforcement. In this election, I think it's another of the many reasons why it's so important for people to remember January 6th. And Sarah, maybe you can talk a little bit about the extent to which on that day, you all in the West Wing saw what was happening. You saw the extent to which law enforcement was being brutalized. And so when Donald Trump claims to be the party of law enforcement, or Republicans who now excuse what happened make that claim, how should people out there react to that? How should they hear that?
Yeah, it's shameful that he claims to back the blue, but then is out there saying that he wants to pardon the January 6th rioters. I don't know how those two things, you can't square that circle for me, sorry. And, I think it just speaks to his real feelings about that day, that he was enjoying what he was seeing. He enjoyed seeing this mob go fight for him because he wanted to remain in power at all costs. And we know that from the January 6th committee hearings that he was handed a note that one of the rioters had been shot, and he still didn't lift a finger. We know from now Jack Smith's filing that he was told by a White House aide that his own vice president, who, mind you, this isn't talked about enough, was at the Capitol that day with his family. His family was with him. And he was told that he had to be evacuated to a secure location. And what was Donald Trump's response? So what? He did not care. And that just shows his utter lack of empathy for others. And it just speaks to how wholly unfit he is. And it's disheartening then that Republicans Republican elected officials, I should say, tend to whitewash the events of that day. Alyssa spoke a little bit about this, that in the immediate aftermath, so many people were united and disgusted by his behavior and wanted to turn the page on Donald Trump. And so if you would have told me that all these years later that he would be the Republican candidate for president, I wouldn't believe you. But that's where we're at, because so few are willing to prioritize what's good for the country above their own ambition. And it just speaks to why Washington is so corrupt. But yeah, it's just frankly disappointing. And I want those Republican officials to be on record asking if they're okay with those January 6 rioters being pardoned, because that's what Donald Trump would do in a second Trump term.
When you're thinking about this election, Cassidy, and I often get the question, what gives me hope? And one of the things that gives me hope is you guys and young people. And I know you're spending a lot of time around the country talking to young people. You know, you sort of had this kind of the worst experience that you can have at the beginning of a career in public service. But I think that you also see that there's a possibility for change and that there's hope. And so can you talk about what gives you hope and what you see when you meet with young people around this country?
I agree to an extent that it was the worst experience, but on the same side, you know, I try to look at the positive side of it too, and that experience brought me here to sit on a stage with you all today and to have this renewed sense of leadership and what it really means to be an American and a citizen in this community. So for as unfortunate as what I went through was, there are so many people in this country who are also going through things because of Donald Trump, because Donald Trump has mastered this ability to target and manipulate people based off of their greatest fears and their greatest fears and anxieties. And he targets these people and manipulates them and seduces them into his power and tells them that he is the solution to their problems. I know this because I was once one of those people that really believed in him. I grew up in a family that was fairly disenfranchised by the government, but felt that he could change things for us, and I believed that he could be that person. And my loyalty to him felt like a very, very small price to pay because I felt that he was loyal to the country. So to circle back about what gives me hope for this upcoming election and in the future years, it's because of people like us and because of conversations that I have had around this country, but it's primarily, and this is a perspective that I hadn't had before and I'm so grateful to have now, because when I made the leap to testify live in front of the January 6th committee, I expected the vitriol from the Trump world. I expected them to come after me. I had once been part of that machine. But what I wasn't sure was going to happen was where I was going to land. Who was going to catch me if I inevitably was going to fall in a couple of days when things got very vicious. And it was the compassion and the empathy and the forgiveness and the love that really brought me back and gave me a second chance at life. It was looking at leaders like Liz Cheney and also Jamie Raskin. It was leaders like Nancy Pelosi. President Biden, Vice President Harris, who showed me out of this period of darkness when I made the decision to step into the light. I didn't know on that day how much my life was going to change. I knew it was going to change. I knew that I was essentially leaving everything I knew behind, but I had no idea how bright life in the light could be. So when I talk to young people, or when I talk to people our age or a little bit older, and I have conversations, a lot of times with Democrats too, I'm reminded of how much more there is that unites us than divides us, but Donald Trump thrives on that division and that fear, and we have to overcome that, and there are so many people in this country who want to overcome that.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I know we have audience questions we're going to take. But picking up on what Cassidy said, one of the things that I feel and hear often as I'm traveling around the country is this idea of, we're all better. We're better. This nation is a good nation, and the people who live here and who participate in our politics, they're good and honorable people. And I wonder, Alyssa, if you could talk about that and about how we can bridge the divide, how we can reject sort of this toxicity, and whether you have that same experience of what people really want and the kind of country they want their kids to grow up in.
I fundamentally believe, as you said, there is more that unites this country than divides it. And Donald Trump thrives on division and in stoking fear. But at the end of the day, I think the majority of Americans love this country. They're invested in it. They believe in the Constitution. They love their neighbors, even if their neighbors have different political views. This notion that if you're in one party, the other side is the enemy is so anti-American, and our adversaries love that, by the way. China and Russia love when Donald Trump is demonizing the left and trying to tear us apart from within. And I think this is such a moment for course correction, which America has a long history of, where we go certain ways and then we course correct because we know the arc of history is long, but this is a moment that, especially I think young people will play a role in it, of just saying we want to reflect the character of this nation, which I believe is good and decent and honorable, and that starts at the top. It starts in the character of the person that we put in the Oval Office. And Donald Trump does not reflect the best of this nation. And I have to say this, I'm still a Republican. As of now, I've never voted for a Democrat. But I was struck, I traveled to Chicago for the DNC, I was there with CNN, and I saw an amphitheater full of American flags waving, chants of USA, and just joyfulness. And that is what I remembered going to the Romney RNC, the McCain RNC. That's who I was as a Republican, as somebody who loved America and was patriotic. I juxtaposed that to this last RNC, and it was mass deportations now. It was rage, it was anger, it was vitriol. It was wanting to attack our fellow Americans just because they vote with a different letter next to their name. That's not who we are, and we have the opportunity so soon to turn the page on that and just to come together as a country.
Great. Now we have some time for a few questions from the audience that folks submitted when they came in tonight. First one, why are Republican male leaders so weak?
Why do we question why women are strong?
It's like you read that and Kevin McCarthy's face just appeared in front of me.
Me too. Me too. Is that,
That was good.
you want an answer? Is that,
We definitely want an answer from you.
look, it is. It's really amazing the level of cowardice, and that's what it is. I mean, when you look at how many of them absolutely know, they know. I mean, I think that you can count on both hands with fingers left how many elected Republicans actually believe what Donald Trump is saying. But they have rationalized, and I think this is a place too where, again, in this election, don't let people get away with it, and don't think that we can be bystanders. I know that folks here in Montgomery County take seriously the responsibility to vote and the duty to do that, but this time period, the history of this period, is going to include the stories of so many Republicans, and most of them are men, who either made a decision that they could look the other way and that they could ignore what was happening, or that they could lie about what was happening. And you know, when you come to a place as a country where you have one party that is dedicated to erasing the truth about the most serious attack on our capital since the War of 1812, that party has lost its way, and those are not people that we can trust to lead us. So look, I think it's not only Donald Trump who has to be defeated on November 5th, but also those who have enabled him.
Thank you. How are Trump and Vance able to spread lies about our elections, seemingly without consequence?
That's a great question. And I'd like to mention this. I never, and I know none of us do, never want to demonize Trump voters. I don't ever, they're my family, some of the people I love most, some of my dearest friends, because I don't blame people for believing their elected officials who are lying to them. These are people who are in positions of public trust that they think they should believe. So when they say things like the election was stolen, they may start to believe that over time, whatever insert the misinformation of the day is. But I hold in particular contempt those elected officials who swore the same oath we all did, who knowingly lie to the American public. And that, the fact that you have people who are willing to, J.D. Vance is a whole new breed. Like, at least in Mike Pence, we had somebody who believed in the Constitution and it was a person who had sound character. He is willing to lie. He basically admitted it when challenged on this lie about Springfield, Ohio. But then add to that the moment we live in of mass misinformation and disinformation that's amplified on social media by America's adversaries who want to tear us apart from within. You can't really put that toothpaste back in the toothpaste tube. So you have willing actors doing it, and then the worst actors spreading it even further. It's a very frightening moment.
And just to briefly add to that, this is where I also see it as an extension of my public service and potentially all of our public service. We have the ability and the privilege of being able to come to rooms full of people like you all and to talk to you all. It's our job and our responsibility to continue these conversations, to continue educating the American people about just the dereliction of duty that J.D. Vance currently is displaying and would potentially display as a vice president who has already pledged that he would not certify the results of an election like that. Again, fundamentally un-American, but the voters can vote for people who they believe in, and they have to trust the information source they're getting it from. So the more voices there are out there, the more people there are that are honest and have integrity out there that are talking about these dangers, the more important it is for voters not only to mobilize and go to the voting stations in a couple of weeks, but to know that it's their responsibility as an American to participate in our democracy as well.
And that's why I hope many of you in the audience tonight, as well as these wonderful young women on the stage, will think about sometime putting your own name on the ballot and running for office. Really, we need good and honorable people to do that. You guys look at me like, are you crazy? But really, it's important.
Do you think the Republican Party may split in two following the election?
You know, I think that it's very hard for me to see how the Republican Party simply comes back from what's going on. I mean, you know, look at what we're living through right now. You have this horrific storm that's about to make landfall in Florida, and not only are Donald Trump and many of the elected officials who support him, you know, using it for political purposes and criticizing the response, they're intentionally spreading lies that could well cost people their lives. And when you're in a situation, you know, and it's not unlike the lies that we saw, the behavior that we saw on January 6th, or the lies about what's happened in Ohio. But those kinds of lies, which are being embraced by so many people in leadership positions in the party, in my view, make it very difficult for the party simply after November 5th to say, well, you know, we're going to go on as usual. I think a political party has to be able to tell people, listen, this is why you ought to vote for us, and they ought to be able to do that with credibility. And I also think that the country has got to have two strong parties. We have to have two parties that believe in the Constitution. That's not where we are right now.
If I could add quickly onto that, just talking about the need to believe in the Constitution, we touched on this a little bit earlier about how the pushback I get often is, how can you still identify as a Republican, yet you say you're going to be voting for Kamala Harris in 2024? And what I say, I'm very excited to do so. I wouldn't have believed you 4 years ago if you told me that I'd be voting for her. But
Could you imagine 4 years ago?
my head would have exploded probably. But I'm genuinely so excited. She's made me so optimistic and given me so much hope in this election that we can finally turn the page on Donald Trump. But what I do want to say is that I would love to be able to go back to debating policy, and that people give me pushback. How can you vote for a Democrat and say that policy, you're willing to set it aside in this election? Because that's what I have been saying. I've been telling people that is my sole reasoning, is that it's the Constitution. Donald Trump has shown us that he will not uphold it. We cannot trust him to defend it. And I don't want to put someone like that back in the Oval Office. He doesn't deserve to step foot anywhere near it. So that is why I'm casting my vote for Kamala.
And very quickly, I would also argue Donald Trump has betrayed what it meant to be a conservative. He is not running as what made us all Republicans, whether it's blocking a border security bill that would have secured the border, whether it's betraying our allies by not supporting Ukraine, whether it's caving to China by backing down on a ban on TikTok. There are so many examples. Wanting to put in place tariffs that are going to increase the national debt and going to be a recessive tax on consumers. This is not a Republican or a conservative, so you can definitely set policy aside because he's not running as a Republican.
The next question is about how we talk about democracy. We've seen it be perceived as the term itself be used in a partisan way. What do you all think the right way to talk about the threat to democracy? How do we bring democracy back into being a nonpartisan term?
Yeah, I think one of the things that that I hope as we look back on, especially the last 3-4 years here, is that it has given people a real reason to sort of pause and think about how we're teaching young people about democracy, how we're teaching young people about the Constitution. I hope it's given all of us a civics lesson, and that all of us really need to take the time to make sure that we understand, how is this presidential election process, how does it work, what are the pieces of it, how can it be subverted, which is what we're watching Donald Trump try to do. We also, I think, need to do a better job at teaching our kids history. And I think that will help a good deal. I mean, when you have, and I saw it among members of Congress, a complete lack of understanding about the role of the judiciary, the role of the courts. One member at one point before January 6th, she was standing on the floor of the House, and I remember watching her say, "We don't have to let the courts tell us what to do." And, yeah. and I kept thinking, like, you do actually, like, that's how this works.
Quite diplomatic.
But that's, when you have people get to Congress who don't fundamentally understand what it means to be a nation of laws. And look, I think that it can be a big challenge as political leaders, especially if you look at, how toxic our politics has been in the past. And I think every single one of us who has been in public office, will look back and say, I know when Speaker Pelosi selected me for the January 6th committee, I did on a number of occasions think, I hope she hasn't read my Twitter feed. I hope she hasn't read my Twitter feed. But I think that there's such a tendency, and both parties do this, there's such a tendency to demonize our opponents. And what happens then is when you then have someone like Donald Trump, who truly is an unrecoverable threat if he is elected again. He's got to be defeated on November 5th. But when we then come up with, face that kind of a threat, we have to make sure that people aren't just sort of saying, well, okay, that's politics, that's, that they really are focused on why he presents that kind of threat. And I think that requires an understanding of how our democracy works and functions. And the last thing I would say about this is we have to study the history of democracies around the world, because that history teaches us that democracies fall, and they fall at the hands of strong men, they fall at the hands of populists, they fall at the hands of people who do what Donald Trump has done, as Alyssa said, of convincing good and honorable people to believe their lies. And we have to not become so complacent here that we don't stand up against that when we see it begin to happen in our own country.
And if I just may mention, the best book that I've read on this is How Democracies Die. I highly recommend it. It goes through historic examples and contemporary ones, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, to just give you a sense of how America is not immune from falling as a great power and as a democracy.
We are just an experiment.
That's a great segue to the next question. For folks that know undecided voters and their family, what's one book you would recommend they read?
Oath and Honor by Liz
Yeah.
Cheney.
I know two great ones.
Yeah, other than the books you wrote.
I tell everyone to read both your books, just to be honest.
My publisher's very happy with you guys right now.
I'm not even sure that, I don't know that they even need to read an entire book. I would say, I certainly support that, I recommend it, but.
We love literacy.
But
yeah.
if you, I tell people, read the first 100 pages or so of the Select Committee report, the January 6th Select Committee report. That executive summary really lays out in detail what Donald Trump did. Watch the video. Watch the video of the assault on the west front of the Capitol. Watch, the hearings. But ultimately, for those undecided voters, the real question is whether you are willing to risk putting the power of the most powerful office in the nation and in the whole world in the hands of someone who is depraved. And we just simply can't risk doing that. And if you wonder whether that's an accurate description of Donald Trump, you could watch his rallies, as Vice President Harris has suggested. But just go back and watch what he did. And anyone who has attempted to overturn an election and seize power like that is just simply too dangerous.
And I'll quickly add on to that character matters. And so obviously, we're talking a lot about democracy and the Constitution, but we should be electing leaders who we want our children to look up to. And I don't think anyone wants their children to grow up and behave like Donald Trump does. And I would want my future children to grow up and be role modeled after you. I mean, your
And
children
you
should be
guys.
so proud of you.
You guys.
And I genuinely, wholeheartedly mean that. And I think that that is something that I say to undecided voters when I have conversations with them. Yes, of course, policy matters, but at the end of the day, so does character. And I don't want my future children to know that I sat on the sidelines of history and didn't speak out and tell the hard truths when it mattered most.
Unless there are people in the room who are fine with their children throwing china at the wall when they are angry at
Ketchup.
a decision, that might be a separate conversation that we need to have, but
And ketchup.
which complements the burger.
Other than you all, who are extremely important voices right now, I think, for this moment in our country's history, with democracy on the line, who are other leaders that you think should be elevated right now on this issue?
It's a good one. I think of people like former Lieutenant Governor of Georgia, Jeff Duncan, who spoke out in a state that was directly Donald Trump tried to steal votes in his state. We remember the I just need 11,000, however many votes, and he broke with this party, and he's continued to do so. There's a little bit, if I'm being honest, a dearth of leadership within the Republican Party. I basically look to this woman, but there's a lot of smart writers and thinkers out there who I think are talking about the threat that Trump poses, but also what we could be as a future party. I think of people like Charlie Sykes. I think of some of the writers at the Bulwark and the Dispatch. They give me hope that we can have a strong, functioning two-party system where we have legitimate disagreement on policy, but we know at our core what we want America to stand for and what we expect from our leaders.
I'll add another voice that I think has been hugely important, and if you watched 60 Minutes this past Sunday, you saw him featured, but it was Stephen Richter in Maricopa County in Arizona. He has been one of the election officials who would not go along with Donald Trump's plan to try to overthrow the government, and has spoken the truth about how their elections were safe and secure in that state, and he lost his job over it. And so I would really encourage you guys to go back and watch the episode from this past Sunday, because he's someone who deserves a lot of credit too for his heroism in speaking out. And there are countless other officials like that who have done it as well. I mean, Adam Kinzinger comes to mind. He was, And so there is a small group of us, but there's strength in numbers. And so I think I've lost hope of more Republicans speaking out before
It's
election
never too
day,
late.
But it's never too late. So, you know, I'm
never
looking at
too
you, Mitt
late.
Romney. If you want to vote for Kamala and endorse her, that'd be fantastic. But
The only other thing I will add, and I believe the number might be more accurate now, but I believe the last number I saw was there were around 91 former Trump administration officials who have denounced him and have refused to support him in this next election. Which is a very impressive number and probably a historic number from a former presidential
his
administration.
own VP hasn't even endorsed him,
And-
mind
Yeah.
you. Former
People
VP,
have-
I should say.
People have their reasons for not wanting to be more vocal, and without knowing their personal reasons, I am not comfortable chastising them or trying to shame them out of their decision. But I will say from my position, it can be scary at times, it can be frightening. But what frightens me more is the possibility of a second Trump term, and knowing that I may not have done everything that I could possibly do to make sure that he never gets near the Oval Office again. And the closest he gets to the Oval Office is the Joseph Prettyman courthouse when he goes there for his trial.
I just want to briefly underscore what you pointed out, which is so historic and important. His own vice president is not supporting him. Multiple former chiefs of staff, former national security advisors, multiple former Department of Defense heads, chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, his White House comms director, deputy press secretary, another White House comms director. The list goes on. All of us who saw him up close and personal as president in some of the senior most roles and the most consequential roles are the people saying he should be nowhere near the Oval Office. This has never happened before.
You know, and one of the things that you guys have all touched on, which I think is so important, is the role that individuals played. You guys, and when another thing that I often will hear from people is they'll say, well, he can't be that big of a threat because our institutions held. But they don't, and they didn't hold themselves. You know, it was people like Stephen Risher and Rusty Bowers in Arizona and Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, Republicans who, and of course Vice President Pence, Republicans who would not do what he wanted. And I think that's why, you know, J.D. Vance is Donald Trump's vice presidential running mate because Mike Pence abided by his oath to the Constitution. And Donald Trump doesn't want a running mate who will do that. And so again, I just, you know, remember as you're talking to people about how important this is, that it's us, it's individuals who have got to make sure that our institutions hold, and they do provide tremendous examples of leadership. And I especially loved that Stephen Risher was interviewed on 60 Minutes. The way they explained it was that, you know, of course, Donald Trump, after saying he would be there, basically was too scared to show up for a 60 Minutes interview. And so instead, they interviewed Stephen Risher, who is one of the most eloquent officials around, explaining why Donald Trump's lies are lies and so dangerous.
That's poetic.
It's the last question we have time for. You probably did not imagine 5 years ago you'd be in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, discussing democracy. Predict where you think you'll be 5 years from now.
I hope to be supporting Liz Cheney's run for president. That is only if Kamala does not win in 2024, which we're hopeful that she does, and then she can.
Well, even if
Well,
neither
true.
vice president does, we could have a
Yeah, true.
competitor.
I was like, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but
I'm
that's where I
signing
would
on
hope.
for all of your campaigns. So I want you guys to be the vanguard of leading the country and continuing to serve the way you have so admirably. That was it. That was a very
There's
good
been a lot of
collective
applause.
non-answer.
There's been a lot of applause, but thank you all so much
You guys
for
are wonderful. Thank you.
coming here.